All right. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the deep dive with Deploy Solutions on building software solutions for climate change. Deploy Solutions connects space-based Earth observation data with the needs of global organizations and businesses by providing innovative solutions and software applications. These space apps present space data in a manner that can be easily utilized to bring a plethora of benefits to end users. We've got an exciting session planned for you today. However, first, a few housekeeping things. If you have questions, please use the Q&A section to ask your questions. And we have a dedicated Q&A period where we will answer all of your questions. So to start off our webinar today, I will bring forth the founder of Deploy Solutions. Nick Kellett has taken advantage of his programming skills to live and work around the world while following developments in the space sector for nearly 30 years. With technical expertise, business credentials, and a passion for space, Nick helps businesses do great things with space data. As well as his technical expertise, he's been writing online about space exploration since 2013 on his personal blog. So do check him out on Deploy Solutions and his personal blog. Nick, over to you. Let's hear about what you got planned.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hussein. So we'd like to break this into two sections. We do want to start with the problems, communication problems, and set the stage for how we went about identifying those and what they are and what are the consequences of some of these. The second part is actually going to be about some solutions. So we're going to go into some prototype demos. We're going to talk about some of our concepts. We're going to talk about the importance of data and reporting, and then what the future steps will be. So this deep dive is broadly broken into two. We actually have two Q&A opportunities. So first of all, at the end of the first section on problems, and then second, at the end of the overall deep dive. And of course, we're happy to answer your questions subsequently. So please, as something crosses your mind, put it in the Q&A section, and we'll do our best to answer all of those as we go. So briefly about Deploy Solutions. We're Canadian software developers, and we're passionate about space and the Earth, as Hussein mentioned. We are experts in software research, development, and innovation. We develop cloud-hosted solutions, and we use big data, including big data from space, so Earth observation imagery and so on. We organize an event called Space Apps Ottawa, which is the Ottawa equivalent of the NASA International Space Apps Hackathon that happens every year. And we have been focused on citizen-focused aspects of climate change on a research project since 2019. What we do professionally is we're actually working to unlock the value of a lot of the satellite imagery and other imagery that's available. Depending on who you talk to, anywhere from 5 to 10% of this, of what is already available is in use in end user applications. It's actually not a lot. And of course, there are more satellites being launched every day. And so we see an opportunity, and we're working to unlock that real value by using a software factory technology and approach that allows us to streamline that software development process and get working applications in the hands of end users very quickly. So you might be wondering why we're concerned about climate change. Well, in order to build a software factory technology and approach, we actually need a benchmark application that we can use to see if everything is working. And we could choose anything. So we thought that we might as well work on something that we care about. In addition, obviously, we are affected by climate change impacts and disasters, as are our friends, our neighbors, our citizens, people around the world. So we're concerned about that. We know that this is a growing problem, and we accept the science and the risk behind this. So we think that this is very important, and we also believe that there's an opportunity for businesses to step in and take part in this fight to deal with the climate change impacts. So that is how we sort of embarked on this journey. And just to very briefly set the stage, I think we're all familiar with this, but the landscape is changing. We have a climate change emergency, extreme weather events. It's not hard to find those on the news now. We know that Canada is warming at about twice the world average, especially in the north. So these are having really big impacts on us. And in 2019, the federal government of Canada actually declared a climate change emergency and committed to the Paris Agreement targets. We just recently had updates to that. There's now even more stringent targets that are being aimed for, but we recognize that no matter what we do, we're going to need to adapt and mitigate risks. We're going to need to help with disaster responses, and we're going to need to recover because, even if we make good progress now, which we really urgently hope we do, it's still not going to prevent all the impacts of the climate change that are currently unfolding. So we embarked on a major climate change research effort way back in 2019. We actually started surveying and interviewing hundreds of citizens, non-government organization people, scientists, government officials, many others. And my colleague is going to speak about that in a second. So we identified top communication problems getting citizens to act on climate change risks. And when it comes to climate change, obviously it's a massive topic, very complicated for a variety of reasons. We can't focus on everything, so we decided to focus on something that we thought we could tackle, which is ways that software could assist, and focus more on the citizen side of things and on the local community side, which we think has been a little underrepresented in some areas, certainly in terms of software development. So we're building software that we think will help. And how we did it, we'll talk about in a moment, but we had major contributions from a wide variety of people. So we had, citizens and others who were willing to interview with us. We had students from around the world who were contributing in their courses on various research topics. And there's a list on the side there that you can see, and it's a growing list of all the various research projects that students have undertaken. And basically the goal and approach that we took for this project is initially we didn't know much about it. So we started from a position of ignorance. I'm not going to pretend we have all the answers right now. We don't even know all the questions, but we have a lot more information than when we started. And so we knew that we wanted to build something that was genuinely useful to individuals, to citizens. And so we came up with basically two high-level project goals. We wanted to find a worthwhile problem, and we wanted to find a solution, which is the minimal viable product that we could tackle. And that's effectively what's called the running lean approach. It was popularized by Ash Maurya in his book, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the idea is that you iterate and you spend the least amount of effort and time to gather the most amount of information, which turned out to be very effective for a very heavy R&D project such as this. So now I'm going to switch to my colleague Justin Mosby. He's our R&D and innovation manager, and he's been a major sponsor and guide to this climate change effort. And he's going to speak to us about the problems that we identified. Justin.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm going to take you through how we did the research. Next slide. We did extensive secondary research on citizen challenges, including reading academic journals, municipal and insurance guidelines, and provincial adaptation toolkits on environment and climate change Canada. I also attended climate change conferences here in Kingston, where I established great network of climate champions. In summer 2019, we began to use Ripen, experiential learning platform, to get in-depth student-led market research on climate change related topics. And that's how I joined the climate change project. I'm an alumni of Smith School of Business at Queen's University. I graduated last year, and I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. And as an international student, it was an academic requirement to do a market research for a North American company. I did my co-op with Deploy Software Solution on climate change project while studying full-time. In our first task, we conducted an initial survey on Canadian citizens, and I will share with you some of the results. Next, please, Nick. We adopted the interview structure from Running Lean by Ash Maurya, which Nick has mentioned earlier. We conducted interviews around problem customer segment of the Lean Canvas model. All interviews were conducted virtually via Zoom, which was very successful. We used the problem interview script, which involves setting the stage, telling our story, and we wrapped up by asking permission to follow up with our respondent to showcase our demo when it was ready, and we also asked them for referrals. Next. We started from a position of formation based on research that we did, and during the interviews, we presented the set of problems we had identified, and we asked which were randomly ordered to avoid introducing bias. And an option of not applicable was present in case the respondent felt they couldn't answer. We then asked them to rank the problems in order of priority from the highest to the lowest by dragging and dropping them on SurveyMonkey. Next. Some of the tools we used for the research were Zoom for interviews. As you can see from the screenshot, we began our interviews in late 2020. We paused in early March because of COVID and resumed in May until August. We used Asana for project management, which helped us to know the status of our task. We're still using Asana up to now. Contacts have responded who wanted to follow up on the progress of the project were recorded on Zoho CRM. We also used OneNote for transcribing the notes and analyzing the interview notes that we took. Last but not least, we used Tableau Prep for data preparation and Tableau Desktop for reports, which my colleagues will share with you later. Next. Now I'm going to share with you on interview results. As mentioned earlier, we conducted our initial survey on Canadian attitudes, and from the survey we established that more than 2/3 of respondents agreed they could take meaningful action to cope with climate change, while 70% of the respondents agree they will likely use a website or mobile app that listed specific and personal action to cope with climate change. Next. We conducted 115 interviews of 30 minutes each, of which was carried out between January and August 2020. 43% of the respondents were from Ontario province, because that's where most of our contacts were based. We're also based in Ontario. The respondents ranked the problems we presented during the interview on how well it resonated with them, and we picked the top 3, which I'll share with you in the next slides. 57% of the respondents were from NGO, 10% were official from the 3 levels of government, 4% were faith-based organization, while 8% did not identify themselves with any organization. Technically, all respondents are citizens, since we asked them on behalf of themselves and also in the context of their role. Next. The first problem we had, according to them, was that citizens feel overwhelmed. We heard of how complex and scientific information is presented and explained. Overwhelming volume of information. This is something we also encountered during our research. For instance, when you go to Climate Canada and search for flooding, so many documents will pop up, and some were up to 300 pages. And it took a lot of time for us during that research period. Also overwhelming emotionally. We had of eco-anxiety and despair. And someone shared the experience of how they were hit with multiple flooding events in Fredericton over the last few years. We also had of conflicting information from different sources. Citizens aren't given options, and citizens don't have time to act or have different priorities or busy their lives. Next. The second problem that resonated with them was authorities have difficulty directly collaborating and sharing information with citizens. And they say there's no clear communication channel between citizens and authorities. Lack of feedback from authorities when citizens do communicate. And if they communicate, it's after a long time. Personnel and capacity challenge within authorities limits ability, effectiveness of communication efforts. We also heard of complicated scientific information that was not clearly communicated or understood by citizens or even the policymakers. Lack of trust between citizens and authorities. And the big question that arose was, who is a trusted authority? My colleague Nick will speak later on the same. And lastly, encouraging citizen action is not a priority of the authorities. Next. The third problem, according to the respondent, was citizens received information that isn't personalized. They said information was not relevant to citizens or did not meet specific needs. They also felt that it was not localized. They said information on climate change impacts did not communicate the benefits to them, and it was not communicated well, and they said they did not trust the people who communicated the information. They also felt the information shared lacked personalized guidance. There was not enough options provided to citizens, and their interests and priorities were not considered as well. Those were some of the impression we got from the people we spoke with. And thank you very much for listening. Back to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Justin. So again, these were beliefs that were shared with us. Some of those items you may or may not agree with, but collectively it was pretty clear that those were the top 3 problems. We ran into a challenge early on around the definition of what we initially called trusted authorities, rather perhaps naively, because people trust different organizations and different people for different reasons. So that became clearly something that we had to dive into more closely. So I'd like to talk now about trust, belief, and willingness to act. So we tasked the students at Utah Valley University to delve into this. They actually performed a psychographic and sentiment analysis project on attitudes to local conservation and climate change. If you're not aware, the psychographics is a classification technique, and it's used to cluster respondents together based on their values, opinions, and beliefs. So it's different from demographics, where you might group people by age group or by location or by job role. Here it's more how people, what their values are and their thoughts and their feelings. So Utah Valley University performed this activity with Canadian citizens, again using SurveyMonkey. They broke the survey into 2. There were 2 options, Survey A and Survey B. If you were a respondent, you were only given one of these randomly. And so the first survey asked about feelings about environmental conservation, and the second asked about feelings about climate change. And so these were open-ended questions. So how do they feel about their assigned topic, climate change or environmental conservation? How in control does the respondent feel in making a positive difference for their assigned topic? What actions can they take to make a positive difference? And what tools would help them make that difference? And we're going to concentrate on the first couple of items because we think that there's an interesting finding here. Having done that effort, they have a smart lab, which is effectively a deep dive research institution at Utah Valley University, and they performed a cluster analysis and they analyzed the qualitative results, which we'll talk about in a second. So the findings, high level, and there were a lot of them, when respondents were asked how in control they felt they were to make a positive change for either climate change or local environmental conservation, the people who were assigned the conservation felt on a level of 1 to 5, where 5 is most in control. On average, they had about 2.62. So they generally felt in control, whereas the people who were asked about climate change and how much ability they had to take positive action were about 2.05. So that's a significant difference. And according to the Utah Valley University analysis, it's not random. So in other words, people who were asked about local conservation felt more able to take control. People who were asked about climate change felt less able. And that's a pretty interesting finding from a communication perspective. Additionally, respondents in the more urban areas felt less in control in their ability to make a positive impact than respondents in rural areas. And we know that respondents in urban areas are more likely to believe in anthropogenic human-caused climate change than people in rural areas. So this means that the people who are more likely to believe in anthropogenic climate change, or accept it, I should say, actually feel less in control to do anything for it. So that's a pretty compelling finding that that was surfaced by the students. They also produced a tag cloud on the sentiments that were expressed. So again, this was a psychographic survey. So they were asked, what are their thoughts and feelings, and what are some key words that they could contribute, and then a tag cloud was created. So overall, when describing their feelings on local conservation, a large proportion of the words were positive and only a relatively small proportion were negative, but about half the feelings that were described for climate change were negative from respondents. In other words, it's a far more overwhelmingly negative concept and topic than local environmental conservation. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's an example of that tag cloud. The people who were responding, words used by those in the local environment. At the top, they're in green, they're happier. The ones at the bottom are those who were responding about the climate change feelings. And then they did some cluster analysis, which again, you can see the words are popping out here, but the words like disappointment, sadness, doom, desperation, all related to climate change, whereas on the environmental conservation side, you see words like peaceful, optimism, happiness. I mean, there's still some negative words, but generally it's a much more positive opinion. So we think this is a pretty interesting finding. Well, we needed more perspectives on that, or perspectives, I should say. So we wanted to ask citizens how they felt about climate change personally and where they get their information and who do they trust. So we did a SurveyMonkey survey. We had 83 respondents, most of them Canadian. The age groups between 18 to 44 were the most represented, especially 25 to 34. And about 70% rated climate change as very or extremely important to them. And only 5% of those who responded rated it as not so important or unimportant. And because it seems to be skewed based on a younger population responding, we expect that these attitudes will either continue the same or they'll even increase. So we also asked them what sources of information they use to learn about climate change. It turns out that social media, as you would expect, is actually a very significant proportion. Websites and blogs are also up there. Academic institutions, some of them were students, and they did listen to information from the academic institutions. Less people actually got information from newspapers and magazines and television and radio. So we think this is an interesting finding. Again, it was a demographic that tended to be younger. So we think that this will probably increase. And we asked them, how much would you trust information about climate change if you heard it from? And the various options were scientist or academic, environmental or non-government organization, federal government or official or organization, a provincial territorial government organization, a municipal government official or organization, a friend, a family member, or a neighbor or colleague. And actually, the most trusted sources are scientists, environmental groups and NGOs, and federal government officials. So we're starting to put together a picture of this, but we realized that even more work needed to be done. So we just completed work with Ontario Tech University. They undertook a project to explore, what is the definition for a trusted authority? What is the role of trusted intermediaries between the authorities and the citizens? What kind of academic research is out there? What are some of the things to consider or to worry about? What are some of the obstacles here? We recognize these are really complicated issues, and we believe that there's an opportunity to leverage approaches in many other fields that are well established, like international diplomacy, fiduciary trust, and so on, to help find a better solution. So they looked a little bit into that. Here are some of the recommendations. So they recommend supporting individuals and local communities based on something called Ostrom's principles, which talk about setting boundaries, which could be jurisdictional or geographical, within which people will act. So in our example, we're going to be talking about local communities and individuals. So the boundary in this example would be a very municipal or community-based boundary, but there may be other boundaries around it, such as provincial jurisdiction or federal jurisdiction or geographical area. Maybe it's a region of the country and so on. But they believe that the organization at the local level is organic. It can't be imposed, and it must be respected. Having said that, that local level should be supported by expert advice, finances, networking, and other assistance. So in other words, enable the local level, the boundary, the people, the individuals there, or the grassroots community to act as best you can, but don't impose rules on them. And the resources and the people acting on them are nested, so the information has to flow up and down, and this is an important finding that we have. They also gave advice on recommended actions or guidance. So obviously, if you want citizens to take action, you need to tell them what to do. And so they recommend obviously providing accurate guidance to citizens, but they believe it's important to have bidirectional information sharing. So it's not just a question of pushing information to the individuals, but they should be able to push information back to the officials or the people at the other levels. Collectively, they're viewing this information as part of a common pool of resources, which comes back to the findings related to Ostrom. This is interesting because if you look at these recommended actions as a pool of resources, then it becomes interesting. It suggests ways in which they can be managed. And a big question is, who decides on the worth of an individual piece of information in a specific context? They're recommending using a mediator or some kind of approval process before information is released, which makes sense, and establishing clear communication channels with different audiences. And we talked about that earlier. One interesting finding is that blockchain technology could be interesting to ensure a piece of information is not subsequently modified when it's being transmitted. We find that's pretty interesting. It's not a conclusion that we've delved into very quickly or very much, because we just received these findings just a couple of weeks ago. But for those who are not aware, blockchain is a technology that basically allows you to show what the history of a piece of information was. It's used for cryptocurrencies and other transactions, but it could be used for recommended guidance. You could have the whole history of what was done to that information if it was modified. And if it is modified by somebody, it can invalidate that piece of information. So you can actually tell if somebody is trying to spread misinformation by trying to modify a specific item if it's managed using blockchain. So we actually think this is pretty cool and something that we want to explore a little more. We also asked for their help in coming up with a trusted authority working definition. This is a work in progress, but basically trusted authorities are individuals or organizations, and they have exceptional targeted knowledge and expertise of global warming and climate change issues, impacts, resilience, and/or policy measures. And they can be reasonably expected to provide unbiased apolitical advice, and they accept the currently available scientific understanding of global warming and climate change as described in the UN IPCC. So this is what we've come up with so far, and we're certainly open to suggestions. What the students at Ontario Tech University suggested is the role of trusted intermediaries. And this is not something we'd initially considered. We were expecting to try to bridge the gap between the authorities and the citizens. But of course, you know, sometimes there isn't a direct line of sight or a level of trust between those groups. Sometimes the message needs to be communicated in slightly different ways to encourage adoption. And so they proposed the use of trusted intermediaries, which would act as a communication link, sometimes and in some ways and to some people. And they'd have to be willing and able to convey or link this information from the authorities to those members of the public who are open to listening to the trusted intermediary specifically. We did a lot of conversations with non-government organizations, environmental groups, and so on, and we think that they would actually be key candidates for the trusted intermediary role because they are active in the communities. In many cases, they have those relationships, they've built up credibility, they're clearly committed to the well-being of the people and the organizations and the institutions that are in the area. And many of them have a national profile as well. So we think that they could actually be a great candidate for trusted intermediaries. And again, because information is being shared and it may have to be repurposed a little bit to ensure communication is done well, there has to be some way of understanding what is being shared and how it's being modified, if at all. And so we think that the blockchain technology or approach might be useful here. And a final note is there is a concept of fiduciary trust, which could be of use here, again, trying to leverage established concepts and mechanisms from other problems or other industries. So a fiduciary is somebody who is required to act for the benefit of another person on all matters within the scope of their relationship, and one who owes to another the duties of good faith, trust, confidence, and candor, and they have the ability to exercise discretion or power. So we think that that actually could be quite interesting here, because we would want to make sure that anybody who is acting as a trusted intermediary has some sort of, they certainly feel some kind of obligation to make sure that they're communicating properly. And obviously, if they're stepping forward to be in this role, they would presumably do so. But maybe a fiduciary trust type scenario would work here. So that's really a high level coverage of the issues of trust and belief and willingness to act. We think there's some interesting findings there. We need to explore them further. Again, these are very complicated issues, but this certainly gave us a lot of material to draw from as we started to work on our prototypes and our concepts. And these are ongoing projects. So in the case of this latest one, it just wrapped up. We're going to do another round in a couple of months, and certainly we're open to partnerships. If anybody on this this call or this webinar has contacts or has information or wants to be involved, we'd love to talk more about this. All right. So having done all this work, it's not just enough to identify the problems. Clearly, we want to create a solution. And again, we wanted to create a worthwhile solution. And again, we're approaching it from the perspective of citizens, individuals, members of the community, local community groups, and we're approaching it from that angle. So we had to figure out, if we have a problem, what is the potential solution to this? And we think that, first of all, we need to understand who we're communicating to. And there's actually several different audiences based on what we just discussed. So the first is dependent on timings. Before a disaster impact, or during or after a disaster or impact, people maybe have very different levels of receptivity to take action, right? Ideally, everybody would take action and prepare before a disaster and impact, but we know in reality that doesn't happen all the time or as much as it should. Plenty of evidence about that. And we certainly heard from our people who are responding to our surveys or our interviews, they said as much as well. However, we think that we should be trying to communicate to people before a disaster impact. And so the people who accept anthropogenic climate change are certainly likely to be a receptive audience, and they're willing to take preparatory action, or they're willing to lead and or help others take preparatory action. If they don't accept the scientific understanding or they don't believe in anthropogenic climate change, but they are willing to act to protect their local environment, or they're willing to lead and or help others protect their local environment, they're receptive too, we think, to these messages. So we don't think we should exclude anybody based on whether they accept that climate change does or does not work, if our goal is to encourage people to take positive action no matter what, which I believe it is. And so this is an interesting conclusion that I think we've come to. It may be familiar to some of you on the webinar already, but we think that approaching it from this angle means not excluding people necessarily based on their acceptance or beliefs around climate change, but wherever possible, empowering them to take action. And then, of course, although we would like them to work before a disaster impact, we know that that doesn't always happen. And so we think that there's the other audience, which is during or after a disaster impact, people who are directly impacted, willing to take mitigation, adaptation, and recovery action, or who are not directly impacted but are willing to help others, especially in communities, are a receptive audience to a solution. So we think that these are key audiences that we could look at when building any solution, and we are going to take this into account when we show you some of the things later on. So we asked as well, how likely would you be to use a website or mobile app that listed specific personal actions you could take to cope with climate change? And 68% would use a website or mobile app that would list personal actions to cope with climate change disasters. So there is an opportunity here to build a website or a mobile app, or both, that could provide this information that people would act on. And so having done all that, we started to work with something called a business canvas. For those of you who are not familiar, it's again part of the running lean approach. The idea is that you very quickly and relatively inexpensively test out different concepts and ideas. It's a bit like a whiteboarding session. We used a virtual product called Canvanizer. But these are two examples where we were quickly tossing around ideas on how to get to a problem solution fit. So having identified the problem, what could we do about it? This is an example where we're focusing on flood disasters. So in this example, the problem on the left there is citizens receive flood awareness information that isn't personalized for their needs, again, based on our findings. The solution is that we could provide a website with relevant specific tasks based on their personal circumstances, local geography, and flood risk. And the unique value proposition would be that it would provide a personalized list of actions that the citizens could take. So again, we're trying to come to a problem solution fit that was going to lead to a meaningful problem. Solution to a problem, and this is the way that we did it. So with all that said, I know that that's kind of a high level run through of our problems that we identified in our research efforts. It's always a bit of a challenge to try to fit a couple of years worth of research from various sources into a coherent whole, but hopefully that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about in the next section, which is our solutions. Before we do that, we wanted to answer any questions that you may have so far. We're also going to do a break, and then we're going to get into the solutions section. So I think if it's okay,